Chapter 1. The Gray Monday. Carl Davidson hated Mondays, but this one felt heavier than most. The fluorescent lights above his cubicle hummed like they were mocking him, and the chatter from his coworkers was a relentless reminder that he had nothing to contribute. Best Thanksgiving ever, someone gushed near the coffee station. My aunt tried deep-frying a turkey and nearly set the garage on fire. Laughter erupted. Carl stared at his monitor, pretending to read an email he'd already answered. His own Thanksgiving had been a microwave turkey dinner and a football game he barely watched. No fire hazards, no family drama, just silence and the occasional hum of his refrigerator. He adjusted his tie, though no one was looking, and headed to the lunchroom at noon sharp. Same table as always, the one farthest from the door, tucked against the wall like a punishment seat. He unpacked his sandwich, scrolled through his phone, and tried to look busy. Mind if I sit? Carl looked up. Tammy from accounting stood there, tray in hand, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sure, he said, gesturing vaguely. She sat, unwrapping her salad. For a moment, silence stretched between them like an awkward handshake. Then Tammy cleared her throat. So, Thanksgiving? She asked. Carl didn't bother sugarcoating. Had a TV dinner. Watched football. Tammy blinked. That's honest. Figured lying would take more effort, Carl said, biting into his sandwich. She laughed softly. Fair enough. No family around. He shook his head. Nope. Tammy didn't push. She just nodded and stabbed a cherry tomato with her fork. Carl appreciated that. Most people tried to fix loneliness with pep talks. Tammy seemed to understand that silence wasn't always a problem. Back at their desks, Carl was halfway through a spreadsheet when his phone buzzed. Boss's office. Now, great. He smoothed his tie again and walked in to find Tammy already there, perched on the edge of a chair like she was waiting for a verdict. Their boss, Marlene, smiled like a cat who'd cornered two mice. You two are planning the Christmas party. Carl blinked. Excuse me? Office tradition, Marlene said briskly. Every year, 2 volunteers handle it. This year, no volunteers. So I picked you. Tammy gave a weak smile. Sounds fun. Carl opened his mouth. Actually, no excuses, Marlene cut in. You're both creative, organized, and frankly, I trust you more than the rest of this circus. Carl felt his stomach drop. Christmas. The word alone was a punch to the gut. He hadn't touched a Christmas tree in 7 years. Not since the night his life cracked open like thin ice. Tammy glanced at him, curious. We'll make it work. Marlene clapped her hands. That's the spirit. I want magic this year. Joy, sparkle, the whole 9 yards. Carl forced a nod, but inside, he was screaming. Magic, sparkle? He was doomed. Chapter 2. The reluctant duo. Carl stared at the blinking cursor on his monitor like it had personally offended him. Christmas party planning. Of all the punishments Marlene could have devised, this was cruel and unusual. He'd rather audit spreadsheets until his eyes bled. A soft knock on his cubicle wall pulled him from his spiral. Tammy stood there, holding a notepad and wearing an expression that hovered between determination and mild panic. So, she said, partners in crime? Carl leaned back in his chair. If by crime you mean holiday cheer, then yes, we're doomed. Tammy laughed, a quick burst that made a few heads turn. Come on, it's not that bad. We just need decorations, food, music. Easy. Easy, Carl repeated deadpan. Like brain surgery. She rolled her eyes. You're dramatic. I'm realistic, he countered. Christmas parties are a minefield. One wrong move and someone's allergic to the cookies, or the playlist offends a department. Tammy perched on the edge of his desk, ignoring the stack of reports he'd been pretending to work on. Okay, Grinch. Let's start small. Theme ideas. Carl opened his mouth to say, how about no Christmas? But Tammy's expectant look stopped him. He sighed. Fine. What's the usual? Ugly sweaters? Secret Santa? Both, Tammy said, jotting notes. But maybe something fresh. Marlene said magic and sparkle. Carl groaned. She also said 9 yards. I don't even know what that means. Tammy grinned. It means we're going big. Lights, garlands, maybe a photo booth. Carl pinched the bridge of his nose. Photo booth. Great. Nothing says corporate bonding like awkward pictures with fake antlers. You're fun at parties, aren't you? Tammy teased. I don't go to parties, Carl said flatly. Her pen paused mid-scribble. Ever. Not since. He stopped himself. No way was he unpacking 7 years of emotional baggage in the middle of the office. Not recently. Tammy didn't press, but her eyes softened. Well, maybe this one will surprise you. Carl doubted it. The last time Christmas surprised him, it ended with laughter that still echoed in his head like a cruel soundtrack. They met in the break room later, armed with coffee and a shared sense of impending doom. Tammy spread out a glossy catalog of decorations like it was a battle map. Okay, she said, tapping a page with a manicured finger. Lights, white or multicolor. Carl sipped his coffee. None. Tammy shot him a look. Not an option. Fine. White. Less cheerful. She smirked. You really hate this, don't you? Carl shrugged. Hate's a strong word. I prefer deeply resent. Tammy laughed again, and Carl found himself almost smiling. Almost. All right, she said, flipping pages. Centerpieces. Snowflakes or reindeer? Snowflakes, Carl said. Reindeer are smug. Tammy blinked. Smug. Look at them, Carl said, pointing at the picture. Prancing around like they own the North Pole. Tammy shook her head, chuckling. You're something else. By the time they finished, Tammy had a list that looked like a small wedding plan. Carl had a headache. Tomorrow, Tammy said, gathering her notes. We hit the stores. Carl groaned. Shopping. My favorite. Think of it as team building, she said brightly. Think of it as torture, Carl muttered. Tammy grinned. You'll survive. Carl wasn't so sure. That night, Carl sat in his apartment, staring at the blank wall where a Christmas tree used to stand years ago. He remembered the way he'd decorated it for her. Gold ornaments, twinkling lights, a star on top like hope itself. He remembered the ring in his pocket, the speech he'd rehearsed, the way her laughter had sliced through him like broken glass. He shoved the memory back into its box and turned on the TV. A holiday commercial blared, all jingles and smiling families. Carl muted it and reached for his phone. A text from Tammy blinked on the screen. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late. We've got sparkle to buy. Carl stared at it for a long moment before typing back, fine, but no antlers. Her reply came fast, no promises. Carl almost smiled again. Almost. Chapter 3, Decorations and Disasters. Carl Davidson hated shopping. He hated the fluorescent lights, the endless aisles, the way holiday music wormed into his brain like a jingle virus. But here he was, standing in the seasonal section of a big box store at 10 in the morning, surrounded by inflatable snowmen grinning like they knew his secrets. Tammy was already in her element, weaving through displays with the energy of someone who actually liked Christmas. She wore a red scarf that looked festive enough to make Carl squint. Okay, she said, holding up a string of multicolor lights. These or the white ones? Carl didn't even glance. White. Tammy frowned. You didn't look. I don't need to. Multicolor screams chaos. White says minimal suffering. She laughed, tossing the lights into the cart. Fine, Mr. Minimal Suffering. What about garlands? Silver or gold? Neither, Carl muttered, eyeing a plastic reindeer that looked smug. They shed glitter like a disease. Tammy grinned. Gold it is. Carl sighed. You're not even pretending to listen. I'm listening, she said cheerfully, loading the cart with ornaments shaped like snowflakes. I'm just ignoring. Carl followed her down the aisle, pushing the cart like it was a prison sentence on wheels. Every corner was an ambush of cheer. Santa figurines, fake snow, nutcrackers with unnerving grins. He felt like they were all laughing at him. Photo booth props, Tammy announced, stopping at a rack of cardboard cutouts on sticks. Look, antlers, elf hats, candy canes. Carl stared. No. Tammy held up a pair of antlers. Yes. No. Carl repeated deadpan. I draw the line at antlers. Tammy smirked. You'd look cute. Carl gave her a flat look. I'd look like someone who lost a bet. Which is basically what this is, Tammy said, tossing the antlers into the cart. Carl groaned. You're enjoying this way too much. Someone has to, she said, moving on to the next aisle. The disaster struck in aisle 7. Tammy reached for a box of glass ornaments perched precariously on the top shelf. Carl saw it happening in slow motion, the wobble, the tilt, the inevitable crash. He lunged, but gravity won. The box hit the floor with a sound like shattered dreams. Tammy froze. Oh no. Carl stared at the glittering mess. Well, that's festive. Tammy crouched, cheeks pink. I'll clean it up. Carl grabbed a store associate, who arrived with a broom and a look that said rookies. Tammy apologized profusely while Carl stood there, hands in his pockets, wondering if this was a sign from the universe. Maybe we should stick to plastic, he said when Tammy returned, looking mortified. Maybe you should have caught it, she shot back, but her smile was sheepish. Carl smirked. I'm not trained for ornament rescue. Checkout was another ordeal. The cashier scanned item after item while Carl watched the total climb like a cruel joke. Company card, Tammy said, handing it over before Carl could protest. Good, Carl muttered. I was about to sell a kidney. Tammy laughed, tucking the receipt into her bag. Relax, it's not your money. It's my sanity, Carl said. And that's priceless. Outside, the cold slapped him in the face like reality. Tammy's car was parked at the far end of the lot, and the cart was loaded like a holiday parade float. Your car's tiny, Carl observed. It's efficient, Tammy said, popping the trunk. Efficient was generous. The trunk swallowed 2 bags and gave up. Carl stared at the remaining mountain of decorations. This is a physics problem, he said. Or a puzzle, Tammy countered, shoving garlands into the back seat. Carl sighed and started rearranging boxes like a reluctant Tetris champion. By the time they crammed the last bag in, Carl was wedged against a box of ornaments, knees up to his chin. This is safe, he deadpanned as Tammy started the car. Think of it as cozy, she said, grinning. Carl muttered something about OSHA violations and stared out the window as snow began to fall, soft and relentless. Great, a snowstorm. Perfect ending to a perfect day. Halfway back to the office, Tammy's wipers squeaked against the glass. You know, she said, glancing at him. You're not as grumpy as you pretend. Carl raised a brow. I'm literally wedged between a fake wreath and a box of smug reindeer. Tammy laughed, and for a moment, Carl felt something shift, a flicker of warmth in the cold. He shoved it down before it could grow roots. When they finally unloaded everything at the office, Carl collapsed into his chair, exhausted. Tammy breezed past, humming a Christmas tune like she hadn't just survived retail combat. Carl stared at the pile of decorations and muttered, We're doomed. Tammy grinned. We're festive. Carl wasn't convinced. Chapter 4. Tammy's backstory. Carl Davidson had a theory. Fluorescent lights were designed to drain the soul. By mid-afternoon, his was running on fumes. The decorations they'd hauled in sat stacked in the corner of the office like a glittering threat. Tammy, of course, was unfazed. She breezed past his cubicle with a smile and a coffee in hand. Break? She asked, tilting her head toward the hallway. Carl hesitated. He had work. Real work. Spreadsheets that didn't involve antlers. But Tammy's expectant look was hard to ignore. He sighed and stood. Fine. They ended up in the cafe across the street. A cozy place with mismatched chairs and the smell of cinnamon in the air. Carl ordered black coffee. Tammy went for a caramel latte with extra whipped cream because of course she did. She stirred her drink, watching the swirl of caramel like it held secrets. So, she said, why do you hate Christmas? Carl froze mid-sip. I don't hate it. Tammy raised a brow. You resent it with every fiber of your being. Carl set his cup down. It's complicated. Complicated usually means a story, Tammy said gently. Carl stared at the steam rising from his coffee. He could tell her. The proposal, the laughter, the way it hollowed him out. But the words lodged in his throat like splinters. Let's just say it lost its charm. Tammy didn't push. Instead, she smiled faintly. Fair enough. I get it. Carl glanced at her. You do. She nodded, eyes distant. 2 years ago, my husband decided he wanted someone younger. Someone with fewer laugh lines and more Instagram followers. Carl blinked. Wow. Yeah. Tammy laughed, but it was brittle. For years of marriage, gone in a text message. He didn't even have the guts to say it to my face. Carl felt something twist in his chest. That's brutal. Tammy shrugged, though her grip on the cup tightened. I spent months wondering what I did wrong. Turns out, nothing. He just wanted shiny and new. Carl studied her, the way her smile wavered at the edges. He recognized that look, the quiet ache of someone who'd been blindsided. It was like looking in a mirror. People are selfish, Carl said finally. They take what they want and leave you with the bill. Tammy's laugh was softer this time. Sounds like you've been there. Carl didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. They lingered longer than planned, talking about everything except Christmas. Tammy told him about her dog, a rescue mutt named Max who hated squirrels. Carl admitted he liked cooking, though he rarely bothered anymore. It was easy. Easier than he expected. When they stepped back into the cold, snowflakes drifted like lazy confetti. Tammy pulled her scarf tighter. Thanks for the coffee, she said. Carl nodded. Anytime. She smiled, and for a moment, Carl felt something unfamiliar. A flicker of warmth that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Back at the office, the decorations loomed like a to-do list on steroids. Tammy clapped her hands. Tomorrow, we start transforming this place. Carl groaned. Define transform. Lights, garlands, maybe a tree, Tammy said, eyes bright. It'll be fun. Fun, Carl repeated deadpan. Sure. Tammy grinned. You'll see. Carl wasn't convinced, but as he watched her walk away, scarf trailing like a ribbon of color, he wondered just for a second if maybe, just maybe, she was right. Chapter 5. Carl's Christmas Curse. Carl Davidson had never hated a tree before, but as he stood in the office lobby staring at the 7-foot evergreen Tammy had ordered, he felt something close to loathing. It wasn't the tree's fault. It was green, symmetrical, perfectly innocent, but it was a trigger, a living reminder of everything he'd buried. Tammy appeared beside him, cheeks flushed from the cold, scarf trailing like a festive banner. Isn't it gorgeous? She said, eyes bright. Carl grunted. It's tall. Tall is good, Tammy said, clapping her hands. Big tree, big cheer. Carl muttered. Big mistake. Tammy shot him a look. You're impossible. I'm practical, Carl said, adjusting his tie like it could shield him from the avalanche of tinsel about to hit his life. Tammy ignored him and started unpacking ornaments. Gold and silver spheres rolled across the table like tiny suns. Carl stared at them, and suddenly he wasn't in the office anymore. He was back in her apartment, warm lights, soft music, the smell of cinnamon. He remembered the ring in his pocket, the speech he'd rehearsed, the way his hands shook as he knelt by the tree. And then the laughter. Sharp, cruel, echoing in his ears like broken glass. Carl blinked hard, forcing the memory back into its cage. He reached for an ornament, his fingers stiff. Tammy noticed. "You okay?" she asked softly. "Fine," Carl said too quickly. Tammy tilted her head. "You look like you're about to strangle that snowflake." Carl set the ornament down. "Just, not my thing." Tammy hesitated, then smiled gently. "You know, you don't have to love Christmas to help me make it nice." Carl almost said I hate Christmas because it broke me, but the words stuck like ice. Instead, he shrugged. "I'll survive." Tammy studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay, survival mode. Got it." They worked in silence for a while, Tammy humming under her breath as she strung lights. Carl focused on the mechanics, hooks, branches, symmetry. Anything but the memories clawing at the edges of his mind. "Do you ever wonder," Tammy said suddenly, "why people go all out for this holiday?" Carl snorted. "Because marketing works." Tammy laughed softly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's about hope." Carl froze. Hope. The word tasted bitter. He'd had hope once, bright, reckless hope, and it had laughed in his face. "Hope's overrated," he said flatly. Tammy glanced at him, her smile fading. "You really believe that?" Carl met her eyes, and for a moment, something raw flickered between them. He looked away first. "Yeah, I do." Tammy didn't argue. She just turned back to the tree, her expression unreadable. By the time they finished, the lobby looked like a holiday catalog. Twinkling lights, shimmering garlands, a tree that practically glowed. Tammy stepped back, hands on her hips, and grinned. "Not bad, Davidson," she said. Carl stared at the tree, feeling nothing but exhaustion. "Sure." Tammy nudged him lightly. "You could at least pretend." Carl managed a half-smile. "Pretend's not my strong suit." Tammy laughed, but it was softer this time, almost wistful. "Maybe you just need practice." Carl didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew pretending was exactly what he'd been doing for years. Pretending he was fine. Pretending he didn't care. Pretending Christmas was just another day. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. Chapter 6. The tree incident. Carl Davidson had underestimated the size of the tree. In the office lobby, it looked majestic, tall, symmetrical, practically glowing under the fluorescent lights. But now, standing in the icy parking lot with Tammy beside him and the tree lying like a fallen giant, Carl realized they had a problem. "Your car," Carl said, staring at Tammy's compact sedan, "is roughly the size of a shoebox." Tammy blew into her hands, her breath fogging in the cold. "It's efficient. It's a clown car," Carl muttered. "That tree's not going to fit." Tammy tilted her head, studying the evergreen like it was a puzzle. "We'll make it fit." Carl raised a brow. "Physics disagrees." Tammy grinned. "Physics has never met me." 20 minutes later, Carl was wedged in the back seat, knees pressed to his chest, while the tree occupied most of the car like an uninvited guest. Branches poked his shoulder, and pine needles were already in his hair. "This is safe," Carl deadpanned as Tammy started the engine. "Think of it as festive," Tammy said, eyes sparkling. "Festive is not OSHA compliant," Carl muttered, brushing a rogue branch from his face. Tammy laughed, and for a moment, Carl almost forgot how ridiculous this was. Almost. Halfway to the office, the snow started. At first, it was gentle, a soft dusting on the windshield. Then it turned into a full-blown storm, flakes swirling like confetti in a wind tunnel. Tammy squinted at the road. "Okay, that's a lot of snow." Carl peered out the window, branches framing his view like prison bars. "You think?" Tammy gripped the wheel. "We'll be fine." Carl snorted. Famous last words. The car crawled along, wipers squeaking against the glass. Tammy hummed a Christmas tune under her breath, and Carl stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You're humming," he said. "It's calming," Tammy replied. "For who?" Carl asked. "Because I'm currently being assaulted by a tree." Tammy laughed, and Carl felt something strange. A flicker of warmth in the middle of the chaos. He shoved it down before it could grow roots. By the time they reached the office, Carl looked like he'd wrestled a forest. Pine needles clung to his coat, and his hair resembled a bird's nest. Tammy, of course, was grinning like they just won a prize. "See?" she said, popping the trunk. "Told you we'd make it." Carl climbed out, groaning. "Define make it." "Because I think I have sap in my ear." Tammy laughed so hard she had to lean against the car. "You're a good sport." Carl gave her a flat look. "I'm a hostage." Inside, they dragged the tree through the lobby, leaving a trail of needles like breadcrumbs. Carl collapsed into a chair while Tammy fussed with the stand. "You know," Carl said, watching her wrestle with the branches, "this is how horror movies start." Tammy grinned. "If the tree comes to life, you can save me." Carl smirked. "I'll let it take you first." Tammy laughed, and for a moment, the sound warmed the cold edges of Carl's mood. He hated to admit it, but something about her, her resilience, her humor, was starting to chip away at his walls. When the tree finally stood upright, Tammy clapped her hands. "Perfect." Carl eyed the crooked angle. It's listing like a sinking ship. Tammy tilted her head. Adds character. Carl shook his head, but he couldn't help the small smile tugging at his mouth. Maybe character wasn't such a bad thing. Chapter 7. Unexpected warmth. Carl Davidson had never been so grateful for central heating. After the tree fiasco and the snowstorm, his coat was damp, his shoes were soaked, and his mood was somewhere between mildly homicidal and ready to hibernate. He was halfway to his apartment when his phone buzzed. Tammy. Hot cocoa at my place? You've earned it. Carl stared at the screen. Cocoa. At her place. His first instinct was to decline, politely, of course, something about being tired or having work to do. But then he pictured his apartment. Silent, cold, and smelling faintly of microwave dinners. He typed back before he could overthink it. Fine. But only if there are marshmallows. Her reply came fast. Extra marshmallows. See you in 20. Tammy's apartment was warm in a way Carl's never was. Not just the temperature, though that helped, but the atmosphere. Soft lamplight, a throw blanket draped over the couch, a faint scent of cinnamon in the air. Felt lived in. Inviting. Shoes off, Tammy said, smiling as she handed him a mug. Steam curled from the cocoa like a promise. Marshmallows bobbed on top, pillowy and perfect. Carl took a cautious sip. Sweet, rich, comforting. Okay, he said, settling onto the couch. This is acceptable. Tammy laughed, curling up in the armchair across from him. High praise. Carl smirked. Don't let it go to your head. For a while, they just sat, sipping cocoa while snow fell outside the window in lazy spirals. Tammy talked about Max, her rescue mutt, and how he once tried to chase a squirrel up a tree and got stuck halfway. Carl chuckled. Actually chuckled. And Tammy's eyes lit up like she'd scored a victory. You do laugh, she teased. Carl shrugged. Occasionally. Rare phenomenon, Tammy said, grinning. Should be documented. Carl rolled his eyes, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him. Don't start a research paper. Tammy laughed, and the sound was warm enough to melt the frost clinging to Carl's mood. At some point, Tammy put on music, soft jazz, nothing too festive, and the conversation drifted. Work, movies, food. Carl admitted he liked cooking, though he rarely bothered anymore. Tammy perked up. You cook? She said, eyes wide. Like, real meals. Carl nodded. I'm not a savage. Tammy grinned. You're full of surprises. Carl smirked. Don't get used to it. The cocoa was gone, but neither of them moved. The snow outside thickened, turning the world into a white blur. Tammy glanced at the window, then back at Carl. You know, she said softly, you're not as grumpy as you pretend. Carl raised a brow. I'm literally sitting here complaining about antlers. Tammy smiled. Yeah, but you showed up. You helped. You didn't have to. Carl looked at her, really looked at her, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes held something steady and kind. He felt a flicker of warmth, unfamiliar and unsettling. Don't read too much into it, he said lightly. Tammy laughed, but her gaze lingered, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, like something was waiting to happen. Carl left an hour later, scarf dusted with snow, cocoa still lingering on his tongue. As he walked to his car, he realized something strange. For the first time in years, the night didn't feel quite so cold. Chapter 8. Office Gossip and Growing Chemistry. By Monday morning, the office lobby looked like a holiday postcard. Twinkling lights, garlands draped like ribbons of cheer, and the tree standing proud despite its slightly crooked lean. Carl Davidson walked past it with his usual stoic expression. But inside, he felt something odd. Not joy, he wasn't ready to call it that. But maybe, less dread. Tammy was already at her desk, scarf bright against her gray sweater, typing with the kind of focus Carl reserved for tax season. She glanced up as he passed and smiled. A quick, warm curve of her lips that made something in Carl's chest shift. Morning, she said. Carl nodded. Morning. Simple. Ordinary. But it felt different. By mid-morning, the whispers started. Did you see Carl smiling? Someone murmured near the copier. Carl? Our Carl? Another voice replied, incredulous. The guy who looks allergic to joy. Carl pretended not to hear, but Tammy caught his eye and grinned. He rolled his eyes and she stifled a laugh. The real test came during the weekly budget meeting. Carl hated these gatherings. Too many charts, too much jargon. But today, Marlene was in rare form, demanding updates on the Christmas party expenses. Who approved the photo booth? Marlene asked, sharp eyes scanning the room. Carl opened his mouth, ready to take the hit, but Tammy beat him to it. I did, she said calmly. It's within budget, and it'll boost engagement. Marlene raised a brow. Engagement. Tammy smiled sweetly. People love photos. It makes the event memorable. Happy employees, better morale. Carl watched as Marlene's expression softened. Fine, but keep it tasteful. Of course, Tammy said, jotting notes like a pro. Carl leaned back, impressed despite himself. Tammy had just deflected a potential lecture with grace, and saved him from speaking in front of the entire team. He owed her cocoa, or maybe a lifetime supply. After the meeting, Carl caught up with her near the elevator. You didn't have to do that. Tammy shrugged, smiling. You looked like you'd rather swallow a stapler. Carl smirked. Accurate. Tammy laughed, and the sound did something to him. Something warm, something dangerous. He found himself wanting to hear it again. Later, as they sorted decorations for the final touches, Tammy teased him about his Grinch reputation. You know, she said, looping a garland over the doorway, people think you're secretly plotting to cancel Christmas. Carl deadpanned. Not secretly. Tammy grinned. Well, you're ruining your brand. You've been almost cheerful. Carl raised a brow. Define cheerful. You didn't scowl when I played music, Tammy said. That's progress. Carl smirked. I was distracted by the tree trying to stab me. Tammy laughed, and Carl felt that flicker again, the one he kept trying to ignore. The one that whispered maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as broken as he thought. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, the office buzzed with holiday energy. Carl packed up his laptop, but his mind wasn't on spreadsheets. It was on Tammy, her laugh, her resilience, the way she defended him without hesitation. As he stepped into the cold evening, snow crunching under his shoes, Carl realized something unsettling. He was looking forward to tomorrow. Chapter 9. The party countdown. Carl Davidson had never seen the office look like this. It was Thursday evening, 2 days before the Christmas party, and the place was a glittering battlefield. Garlands draped over cubicle walls, strings of lights blinked like Morse code, and the tree, still slightly crooked, stood in the lobby like a smug sentinel. Carl sat at a conference table littered with receipts, supply lists, and a laptop that had been glaring at him for hours. Tammy was across from him, hair pulled into a messy bun, sleeves rolled up, typing furiously. We're over budget, she said, frowning at the spreadsheet. Carl leaned back, rubbing his temples. How over? Not catastrophic, Tammy said. But Marlene will notice. Carl groaned. Great. I'll add financial ruin to my holiday bingo card. Tammy smirked. Relax. I'll juggle the numbers. Carl eyed her. You're disturbingly cheerful for someone committing accounting gymnastics. Tammy grinned. It's a gift. They worked in silence for a while, the hum of the heating system filling the gaps. Outside, snow fell in thick sheets, turning the windows into frosted glass. Carl glanced at the clock. 8:47 p.m. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. It was just them, the decorations, and the quiet weight of exhaustion. Tammy stretched, her sweater riding up just enough to reveal a sliver of skin before settling back down. Carl looked away so fast he nearly gave himself whiplash. You okay? Tammy asked, amused. Fine, Carl said too quickly. Tammy tilted her head, studying him. You look tense. Carl snorted. I'm surrounded by tinsel and spreadsheets. Tense is inevitable. Tammy laughed softly, and the sound did something to him. Something warm, something dangerous. He found himself watching her hands as she typed, the way her fingers moved with easy confidence. He wondered what it would feel like to take one of those hands in his own. Stop, he told himself. This is work. This is temporary. This is not Carl. Tammy's voice cut through his thoughts. He blinked. What? You spaced out, she said, smiling. Thinking about antlers again? Carl smirked. Always. Tammy laughed, and for a moment the tension cracked just enough for something else to slip through. Something electric. By the time they finished, it was nearly 10. Tammy closed her laptop with a sigh. Done. We're officially party ready. Carl exhaled. Finally. Tammy stood, stretching again, and Carl's eyes betrayed him. Just for a second. She caught the glance, and her smile softened. You know, she said quietly, you're not as grumpy as you pretend. Carl raised a brow. I'm literally sitting here complaining about tinsel. Tammy stepped closer, her scarf trailing like a ribbon of color. Yeah, but you showed up. You helped. You didn't have to. Carl looked at her, really looked at her, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes held something steady and kind. He felt that flicker again, stronger now, burning through the cold walls he'd built. Tammy, he started, voice low. She tilted her head, waiting, and then his phone buzzed, loud and jarring in the quiet. Carl swore under his breath, fumbling for it. A calendar alert flashed. Reminder. Submit monthly report. Tammy laughed softly, breaking the spell. Work calls. Carl stared at the screen, then at her, frustration simmering under his ribs. Yeah, he said, voice flat. Work? They packed up in silence, but the air between them was different now, charged, humming with something unsaid. As Carl walked Tammy to her car, snow crunching under their shoes, he wondered if he'd just missed something important, something he wasn't sure he'd get another chance at. Chapter 10. Christmas Eve Confession. The office had never looked so alive. Twinkling lights framed every doorway, garlands shimmered like ribbons of frost, and the tree, still slightly crooked, stood proudly in the lobby, glowing under strands of white lights. Laughter spilled from every corner, mingling with the scent of catered food and the faint hum of holiday music. Carl Davidson stood near the punch bowl, nursing a cup of something vaguely cranberry-flavored, and wondered how he'd gotten here. Not physically, he knew that part, but emotionally. He wasn't smiling like the rest of them, but he wasn't scowling either. Progress, he supposed. Tammy was across the room, laughing with a group from accounting, her red scarf bright against her black dress. She looked radiant, not in the glitter and sequins way most people tried to pull off at holiday parties, but in a way that felt real, warm. Carl caught himself staring and quickly looked away. The party was a success against all odds. The photo booth was a hit, the playlist didn't offend anyone, and Marlene even complimented the decorations. Carl should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something else, something heavier, because tonight wasn't just the party, it was Christmas Eve. And Christmas Eve was a wound that never quite healed. He slipped out early, coat slung over his arm, hoping to escape before the memories caught up. But Tammy was faster. "Leaving already?" she called, weaving through the crowd to reach him. Carl hesitated. "Yeah, long day." Tammy smiled, but there was a question in her eyes. "Walk me home." Carl blinked. "You live nearby?" "2 blocks," she said. "And I could use the company." Carl hesitated for half a second too long, then nodded. "Sure." The night was cold, the kind that bit through gloves and turned breath into clouds. Snow fell in lazy spirals, softening the edges of the world. They walked in silence at first, their footsteps crunching against the pavement. "You did great tonight," Tammy said finally. Carl snorted. "You mean you did great?" Tammy nudged him lightly. "You helped." Carl shrugged. "I carried boxes." Tammy laughed softly. "You showed up. That matters." Carl didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was, showing up tonight had felt like walking into a battlefield. Every wreath, every carol, every flicker of light had been a reminder of the night he'd lost everything. They reached her building, a brick walk-up with a wreath on the door. Tammy turned to him, scarf trailing like a ribbon of color against the snow. "You okay?" she asked gently. Carl stared at the wreath, at the twinkling lights in the windows above, and felt the old ache clawing at his chest. He swallowed hard. "I hate Christmas," he said quietly. Tammy blinked. "I figured you weren't a fan, but hate?" Carl nodded, words tumbling out before he could stop them. 7 years ago, I proposed to someone on Christmas Eve. Thought it was perfect, tree, lights, everything. She laughed, thought I was joking. And when she realized I wasn't, he shook his head, the memory sharp as broken glass. She laughed harder. Tammy's breath caught. "Carl." "I walked out," he said, voice flat. "Blocked everyone. Haven't celebrated since. Couldn't. Every time I see a tree, I hear her laughing." Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Snowflakes clung to Tammy's hair like tiny stars. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's awful." Carl shrugged, though his throat felt tight. "It was a long time ago." Tammy stepped closer, her eyes steady. "Doesn't mean it didn't hurt." Carl met her gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just her. The warmth in her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice. Something inside him cracked, just a little. "I thought I was done," he admitted. "Done with hope. Done with all of it." Tammy smiled faintly. "Maybe you're not." Carl stared at her, snow swirling around them like confetti. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his chest. So he did the only thing he could. He reached out, brushing a snowflake from her hair. Tammy's breath hitched. The air between them hummed, charged and fragile. And for the first time in 7 years, Carl felt something he thought he'd lost forever. A flicker of hope. Chapter 11. Tammy's answer. Snow crunched under Carl's boots as he stood outside Tammy's building, the weight of his confession still pressing against his ribs. He hadn't planned to tell her, hadn't planned to tell anyone, but the words had spilled out like water from a cracked dam. And now he felt exposed, raw, like the cold had seeped straight into his bones. Tammy didn't move right away. She just looked at him, eyes steady, snowflakes clinging to her hair like tiny stars. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "Carl," she said, "you're not the only one who's been broken." Carl blinked. "What?" Tammy drew in a breath, her scarf rising and falling like a heartbeat. 2 years ago, my husband decided he wanted someone younger, someone shinier. He didn't even say it to my face, just sent a text while I was at work. 4 years of marriage gone in a sentence. Carl felt something twist in his chest. "Tammy, I spent months wondering what I did wrong," she continued, her voice steady even as her eyes shimmered. "Turns out nothing. He just wanted new. And I hated myself for not being enough." Carl stared at her, the snow swirling between them like a curtain. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his throat. Tammy smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "So yeah, I get it. The anger, the bitterness, the way holidays feel like a cruel joke." Carl swallowed hard. You seem okay now." Tammy laughed softly, a sound edged with sadness. "I'm not completely, but I'm trying." Carl nodded slowly. "Me too." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Felt honest. like they'd peeled back the layers and found something real underneath. You know, Tammy said, her voice lighter now. Maybe that's why Marlene picked us. Carl raised a brow. Because we're emotionally damaged? Tammy grinned. Because we needed this. A reason to show up. To try again. Carl let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped for years. Maybe. Tammy stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against the snow. You're not a placeholder, Carl. The words hit him like a jolt. He stared at her, heart thudding in his chest. What? You said once, about feeling like one, Tammy said gently. You're not. Not to me. Carl's throat tightened. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to. But the fear was still there, coiled like a snake. Tammy reached out, her gloved hand brushing his arm. You don't have to decide anything tonight. Just don't shut the door. Carl looked at her, really looked at her. The warmth in her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice, and felt something shift. Something deep. Something that whispered maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as broken as he thought. I'll try, he said softly. Tammy smiled, and this time, it reached her eyes. That's all I'm asking. They stood there for a moment longer, snow falling like confetti around them, before Tammy turned toward the door. Carl watched her go, his chest tight but lighter somehow, like the weight he'd carried for 7 years had cracked, just enough for hope to slip through. Chapter 12. A new tradition. Christmas morning had always been just another day for Carl Davidson. A day he spent ignoring commercials, muting carols, and pretending the world wasn't wrapped in tinsel. But this year felt different. Not because he suddenly loved Christmas. He didn't. But because Tammy's words from 2 nights ago kept echoing in his head. You're not a placeholder, Carl. He'd replayed that sentence so many times it had worn grooves in his thoughts. And now, standing in his kitchen with a mug of coffee and a stubborn knot in his chest, Carl decided to do something he hadn't done in years. Try. The grocery store had been a madhouse the night before, last-minute shoppers elbowing for pies and turkeys, but Carl had managed to grab what he needed. Nothing extravagant. Just cocoa mix, marshmallows, and a small box wrapped in plain silver paper. He stared at it now, sitting on his counter like a dare. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't anything that screamed romantic gesture. It was simple, thoughtful. Something Tammy had mentioned in passing during their late-night work sessions. A cookbook she'd wanted but never bought because, in her words, cooking for one feels pointless. Carl understood that feeling better than anyone. By noon, he was standing outside Tammy's building, snow crunching under his boots, breath fogging in the cold. He almost turned back twice, once when he reached the corner, and again when he saw the wreath on her door, but then he pictured her smile, the way it softened the edges of everything, and knocked. Tammy opened the door wearing a red sweater and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders. She blinked in surprise, then smiled. Carl. Hey, he said, holding up the bag like a peace offering. I brought cocoa. Tammy laughed, stepping aside. Come in before you freeze. Her apartment was warm, glowing with soft lamplight and the faint scent of cinnamon. A small tree stood in the corner, modest but cheerful, with a single strand of lights and a few ornaments. Carl tried not to stare at it too long. I thought you'd be avoiding Christmas like the plague, Tammy teased, taking the bag from him. Carl shrugged. Consider this exposure therapy. Tammy grinned. I like it. They made cocoa in her tiny kitchen, steam curling from the mugs like promises. Carl added extra marshmallows because he remembered, and Tammy laughed when he handed her the cup. You pay attention, she said softly. Carl smirked. Sometimes. They settled on the couch, mugs in hand, snow falling outside like a slow-motion dream. Tammy curled her legs under her, looking at him with that steady warmth that always seemed to undo him. So, she said, what made you come? Carl hesitated, fingers tightening around his mug. You said something the other night, about not shutting the door. Tammy's smile softened. And, Carl drew in a breath, the words heavy but honest. I don't know if I can open it all the way, not yet, but I don't want to keep it locked anymore. Tammy's eyes shimmered, and for a moment, Carl thought he saw relief flicker there. Relief and something else, something hopeful. That's enough, she said gently. For now. Carl reached into the bag and pulled out the silver-wrapped box, setting it on the coffee table. For you. Tammy blinked. Carl. Don't make it weird, he said quickly. It's not. It's just something you mentioned. Tammy tore the paper carefully, revealing the cookbook. Her breath caught, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright. You remembered, she whispered. Carl shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. You said cooking for one feels pointless. Thought maybe it wouldn't always be for one. Tammy stared at him, and for a heartbeat, the world felt still. Just snow outside, cocoa cooling on the table, and her gaze holding his like it was something fragile and precious. Thank you, she said softly. Carl nodded, throat tight. You're welcome. They sat there for a long time, talking about recipes and music and everything in between, and when Tammy laughed, really laughed, Carl felt something shift inside him. Something deep, something that whispered maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something new. A new tradition. One that didn't hurt. Chapter 13. The placeholder no more. Carl Davidson had never thought Christmas morning could feel like this. Quiet, yes, but not empty. For years, the day had been a hollow echo, a reminder of laughter that cut like glass. But now, sitting on Tammy's couch with a second mug of cocoa in hand and snow falling outside like a slow-motion dream, Carl felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Tammy was beside him, legs tucked under a blanket, flipping through the cookbook he'd given her. Every so often, she'd laugh softly at a recipe name or make a note in the margin. Carl watched her, not in the way he used to watch people, guarded, distant, but openly, like he was memorizing the moment. You know, Tammy said, glancing up with a grin, you've officially ruined my excuse for ordering takeout. Carl smirked. You're welcome. She laughed, setting the book aside. Seriously, Carl, thank you. For this. For today. Carl shrugged, though his chest felt tight. It's just cocoa. Tammy shook her head. It's not. It's you showing up. Carl stared at her, the words sinking deep. Showing up. He'd spent years avoiding everything, holidays, people, hope. And now, here he was, sitting in a room that smelled like cinnamon, with someone who made the silence feel warm instead of heavy. I almost didn't, he admitted quietly. Almost stayed home. Tammy smiled faintly. I'm glad you didn't. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The snow outside thickened, turning the world into a white blur. Carl felt the weight of 7 years pressing against him. The bitterness, the anger, the fear, and realized something startling. It was lighter now. Not gone, but lighter. Because Tammy had cracked the door he'd kept locked, and somehow he'd let her in. I need to tell you something, Carl said, voice low. Tammy tilted her head. Okay. Carl drew in a breath, steadying himself. For a long time, I thought I was nothing more than a placeholder. Someone people settle for until they find what they really want. Tammy's eyes softened. Carl, I believed it, he said, the words tumbling out like stones. After that night, after she laughed, I thought that was all I'd ever be. Tammy reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. You're not a placeholder. Carl looked at her, really looked at her. The warmth in her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice, and felt something break open inside him. Something that had been locked away for too long. You mean that? He asked, almost afraid of the answer. Tammy smiled, and this time, it reached her eyes. I do. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was charged, humming with something new. Carl's heart thudded like it was trying to catch up to the moment. He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers, and felt the warmth seep into his skin. Tammy's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her scarf brushing his arm, her eyes steady on his. You know, she whispered, I think we both deserve a second chance. Carl swallowed hard. Yeah, he said softly. I think we do. The kiss wasn't dramatic. No sweeping music, no cinematic fireworks. Just soft, tentative, and real, the kind of kiss that felt like a promise instead of a performance. When they pulled back, Tammy smiled, and Carl felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Bright, reckless, terrifying hope. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in white. Inside, Carl realized something simple and profound. Christmas didn't hurt anymore. Not because of the lights or the cocoa or the tree, but because of her, Tammy. The woman who reminded him that he wasn't a placeholder. He was enough. Later, as they curled up on the couch with the cookbook between them and plans for dinner forming like quiet dreams, Carl thought about traditions. About how they start small, a mug of cocoa, a silver-wrapped box, and grow into something bigger. Something lasting. And for the first time in 7 years, Carl Davidson looked at Christmas and smiled. Epilogue. 1 year later, the scent of cinnamon drifted through the apartment, mingling with the soft hum of holiday music. Carl Davidson stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of cocoa with the same precision he used for spreadsheets. Though this time, his tie was replaced by a worn flannel shirt and a grin he didn't bother hiding. Marshmallows? He called. Always, Tammy replied from the living room, where Max, the rescue mutt Carl had grown to love, was sprawled under a tree that was anything but crooked. It wasn't extravagant, just simple and warm, strung with white lights and ornaments they'd picked out together. Carl carried 2 mugs to the couch, setting them on the coffee table beside a stack of recipe cards. Tammy looked up, her smile as steady as it had been that snowy night a year ago. Hard to believe, she said softly. Last Christmas you hated everything about this. Carl sat beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. I didn't hate everything, he said. Just most things. Tammy laughed, leaning into him. And now, Carl glanced at the tree, at the glow of lights reflected in her eyes, and felt that same flicker of hope. Only now it wasn't fragile. It was solid, real. Now, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. I think I finally get it. Tammy smiled, her fingers lacing with his. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, blanketing the world in white. Inside, Carl realized something simple and profound. Christmas wasn't about the lights or the cocoa or the tree. It was about this, her, them. And for the first time in his life, Carl Davidson wasn't a placeholder. He was home.